Hello, welcome to my channel. This is a book that I have had for many years, several decades as a matter of fact. It was passed down to me a very long time ago by a relative who is now deceased. And I recently decided to pull it off my bookshelf and begin reading it. So I thought I would record that just for any listeners who are curious about the book. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. This is one of the first two copies printed as test for the first edition, which is Slave, blue at the top. This copy was given to my son, Brian M. Post. And I believe this is a stamp of Emily Post's signature, and the date is August 1922. Bride's Bouquet. The radiance of a truly happy bride is so beautifying that even a plain girl is made pretty, and a pretty one divine. And this is from page 373. Etiquette. In society, in business, in politics, and at home. Replica edition by Emily Post, Mrs. Price Post, author of Purple and Fine Linen, The Title Market, Woven in Tapestry, The Flight of a Moth, Letters of a Worldly Godmother, etc., etc. Illustrated with private photographs and facsimiles of social forms. Fung and Wagnall's Company, New York and London, 1922. To you, my friends, whose identity in these pages is veiled in fictional disguise, it is but fitting that I dedicate this book. A new preface to an old edition. Good taste or bad is revealed in everything we are, do, or have. Our speech, manners, dress, and household goods, or even our friends, are evidences of the propriety of our taste, and all these have been the subject of this book. Rules of etiquette are nothing more than signposts by which we are guided to the goal of good taste. You will find these lines written by Emily Post 50 years ago, at the end of this first edition of Etiquette. They are just as meaningful now as they were then. Etiquette never intended to be a rigid set of rules. It is rather a code of behavior that is based on consideration, kindness, and unselfishness, something that should not and will not ever change. But manners, derived as they are from etiquette, must change to keep up with the world. It is not necessary for me to point out that life has changed since the first edition of this book. How many of us have ever seen a footman, or been presented with a PPC card, or been taught to use a finger bowl? For most of us, those things which are purely out of fiction, to read about them is similar to seeing a rerun of a silent film. It fills us with nostalgia for the golden days gone by, allowing us to forget the discomforts, the prejudices, and the inequalities that were also a part of that life. In looking through this new printing of an old book, I hope that several things will happen to you, the reader. First, I hope you will be amused, not in a derisive way, but tolerantly, as we are when we look at the costumes in a Godey's print. Second, it can provide you with a history of the precedents for present-day etiquette. For amusement, read the chapter about a house party in camp, or compare it with your last trip to the country. The book and the butler, in their liveries of green blazers and gray flannel trousers, Mr. Worldly, who stuns the host, Mr. Kindheart, by bringing his valet, are alas, long gone. Yet those glamorous guests of years ago took the same pleasure in roughing it in their terms that we do. When you despair over your daughter's independence and lack of appreciation of your values, read her the chapter about the chaperone. Emily Post wrote, "Ethically, the only chaperone is the young girl's own sense of dignity and pride. She, who has the right attributes of character, needs no chaperone, ever." At the same time, Mrs. Post's rules allowed the girl little chance to prove whether she had those attributes or not. Either Mrs. Grundy, the old lady living in the square brownstone house with a cupola, equipped with a telescope, or a chaperone in the form of a relative or a lady's maid, were constantly keeping an eye on the poor young thing in order to report at once if she strayed from the straight and narrow. The girls of today might appreciate their freedom more if they realized that only 50 years ago it was forbidden to a girl to go alone with a man to the theater or restaurant, nor could she invite a boy, not even her fiancé, to come in for a while after a party. You may have, if you are lucky, a cleaning woman who comes once a week. You might well ask, what does that have to do with the well-appointed house described in this book with a staff of 10 or 12? But leaving out the frills and the irrelevancies, you will find in the chapter titled The Management of Servants good sound advice on how to get along with your part-time maid. You will enjoy reading about the duties of many retainers, which will make you appreciate your ability to cope with all of those duties alone, with only the help of a few appliances. Entertaining has changed tremendously, but almost all of the practices we follow today can be found in the chapters on formal dinners and limited equipment. There is good advice, too, mixed in with the 7 courses in the finger bowls chapters. On do not experiment for strangers and proper dishing give excellent hints, as useful now as when they were written. And dishes must be hot, they cannot be too hot. Sending in cold food is one of the worst faults the cook can have. A timely tip for many hostesses today, of course. Of the present generation are so conscious of our waistlines that we would be horrified if we were presented with an informal luncheon menu such as the one described in Breakfasts and Suppers. Even if our stomachs could take it, today's servantless hostess would have to be a genius to prepare and serve such a feast. And yet whose taste buds do not quiver, and who wouldn't feel a pang of envy for the pampered ladies who were served and happily ate the following feast: a bouillon or broth, scrambled eggs on toast, which has first been spread with a pâté or meat puree, then chicken or a chop with vegetables, a salad of plain lettuce with crackers and cheese, and a pudding or pie or other family dessert. You will find some chapters that are of no practical use to us now, but that are entertaining and informative as bits of Americana. Take traveling, for example. Commercial air travel was unknown 50 years ago, but there was much to be said about train trips. Dining cars were reserved mainly for Pullman passengers, and coach travelers resorted to box lunches, which provided Mrs. Post with a now non-existent target at which she could shoot her always frank and precise darts. On a railway train, you should be careful not to assail the nostrils of fellow passengers with strong odors of any kind. There is a combination of banana and the leather smell of a valise containing food that is, to many people, an immediate emetic. Now the paper bag or the straw basket has replaced the leather valise, so that today only the cigar smokers and the users of heavy perfume offend the nostrils of fellow passengers. Before writing this book about etiquette, Emily Post had been a novelist, and her skill in storytelling is evident in the way in which certain characters travel through these pages. The worldlies, the gildings, and the eminents are the epitome of elegance, good taste, and to some degree snobbery. On the steamer they sit in segregated chairs and speak to no one except the handful of their personal friends or acquaintances who happen to be on board. At the same time, people like Richard Vulgar could count on a European to increase their social acceptance by just so much each trip. He wanders about the ship persuading the Smartleys and the Lovejoys and celebrity to sit at his table by using the name of one to lure the other. It ends in Vulgar's table being a collection of fashionables whom he could not possibly have gotten together without such a maneuver. The Worldlies live in Golden Hall, the last word in luxury and lavish hospitality. The house is a palace, and the grounds are a park. Mrs. Toplofty, who is possibly next in line in best society, exclaims after a lavish party in the Golden Hall, "How are any of us going to amuse anyone after this? I feel like doing my guest rooms up in mothballs." While the Worldlies are the very most in every way, the old names are as socially acceptable as the Worldlies or the Toplofties, but prefer to live in a simple fashion. But to describe Mrs. Oldname as simple is about as apt to call a pearl simple because it doesn't dazzle. There was not an article in the apparently simple living room that would be refused were it offered to a museum. Mr. Kindheart appears now and again to make little Miss Newlywed feel better about her dreadful faux pas. At a first dinner party, the fireplace smokes, dinner is late, and the soup is greasy. It tastes like dishwater and is barely tepid. Sigrid, the waitress, stacks the plates, and the sauce on the fish is a curdled yellow mess. After all these disasters, Mr. Kindheart, seated on Mrs. Newlywed's right, says, "Cheer up, little girl. It doesn't really matter." She bursts into tears regardless, and the Worldleys and Toplofleys and the Wellborns are very kind, but the young bride knows that they will tell everyone in truth and frankness, "Whatever you do, don't dine with the Newlyweds unless you eat your dinner before you go and wear black glasses so no sight can offend you." Although the surroundings have changed, the setting is an airplane instead of a train, or the dinner is a barbecue on the patio rather than served at a dining room table, our problems of etiquette are not so different today. Soufflés still fall at the wrong moment, or temporary help may still stack the dishes. We still forget names when we make introductions. Emily Post has provided answers to difficult questions that are practical, gracious, and correct for her day. There are many people who resent the changes in manners that have occurred since then. They spend their time moaning about the good old days, which they see through rose-colored glasses. They forget that every past generation has had the same feelings about, for example, the often heard belief that the current younger generation is headed straight for disaster, showing how very similar to today's were the thoughts of 50 years ago. Emily went on to write, "It is commonplace to remark that older people invariably feel that the younger generation is speeding swiftly on the road to perdition. But whether the present younger generation is really any nearer to that frightful end than any previous one is a question that we, of the present older generation, are scarcely qualified to answer. To be sure, manners seem to have grown lax, and many of the amenities apparently have vanished. It is difficult to maintain that youth today is so very different from what it has been in other periods of the country's history, especially as the capriciousness of beauty, the heartlessness and carelessness of youth, are charges of a too suspiciously bromidic flavor to carry conviction." Those words could well have been written today. Elizabeth L. Post.